Millionaire invited his ugly secretary to dinner, but froze when she arrived looking like a goddess. Before we explore all the details of this incredible story, tell us where you're following us from and the time. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss a thing, and let's embark on this journey together. The elevator hummed its familiar tune as it climbed to the 42nd floor, carrying Clara Johnson toward another day of deliberate invisibility. She adjusted her oversized glasses and smoothed down her hair, already twisted into the same tight bun she'd worn for the past 3 years. Her charcoal blazer hung loose over a simple white blouse, chosen specifically to blend into the corporate beige of Walker Industries. Most people would call her plain. Clara preferred the word strategic. The elevator dinged, and she stepped into the pristine marble lobby of the executive floor. Her low heels clicked softly against the polished surface as she made her way to her desk, a modest station positioned just outside the glass-walled office of Alexander Walker, CEO and heir to a business empire that spanned 3 continents. "Morning, Clara." The greeting came from Jennifer, the marketing director, who barely glanced up from her phone. "Good morning," Clara replied, her voice measured and professional. She'd perfected this tone, pleasant enough to avoid rudeness, forgettable enough to avoid attention. As she settled into her chair and powered up her computer, Clara caught a glimpse of herself in the dark monitor screen. 26 years old, honey-brown skin that she kept deliberately makeup-free, full lips pressed into a neutral line, and intelligent dark eyes hidden behind lenses that were probably 2 sizes too large. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her memory. "Sometimes the smartest thing a woman can do is let them underestimate her, baby girl." The office began to fill with the usual morning chaos. Executives rushed past her desk, discussing quarterly reports and merger possibilities, treating her like part of the furniture. She preferred it that way. From her position, she could observe everything while revealing nothing about herself. At exactly 8:30 a.m., Alexander Walker emerged from the private elevator that led directly to his penthouse office. Clara didn't look up immediately, but she felt the familiar shift in the room's energy. Conversations became more hushed, postures straightened, and the air seemed to crackle with the kind of authority that money and power commanded. He was imposing without trying to be, 6 feet 3 inches of tailored perfection, with dark hair that probably cost more to maintain than Clara made in a month. His steel-grey eyes missed nothing, and his jaw was set in the permanent line of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. Today he wore a navy suit that fit him like it had been sculpted rather than sewn, paired with a crisp white shirt and a tie the color of old money. "Ms. Johnson." His voice was deep, clipped and utterly impersonal as he paused at her desk. "I need the Morrison files on my desk in 10 minutes and reschedule my lunch with the board. Something's come up." "Of course, Mr. Walker." She kept her eyes on her computer screen, fingers already flying across the keyboard. "Would you prefer the lunch moved to tomorrow at 1, or would Thursday work better with your schedule?" "Thursday." He was already walking away, speaking over his shoulder. "And call my attorney. Tell him the Singapore deal needs to be expedited." Clara made the necessary notes, sent the required emails, and had the Morrison files perfectly organized on his desk within 8 minutes. Through the glass wall of his office, she could see him on the phone, one hand running through his hair, in what she'd learned was his tell for frustration. His jaw was tighter than usual, and there was a tension in his shoulders that suggested the Singapore deal wasn't going as smoothly as expected. She'd been watching Alexander Walker for 3 years, learning his patterns, his moods, his preferences, not out of romantic interest. She'd never been foolish enough to develop feelings for a man who looked through her like she was made of glass. But understanding him made her job easier, and job security was everything to a woman who'd grown up with none. Her phone buzzed with a text from her younger brother. "Rent's due Friday. You good for your half?" Clara glanced at her bank balance on her phone screen and felt the familiar knot in her stomach. Between her portion of the rent for the small 2-bedroom apartment they shared in Queens, her student loan payments, and helping their mother with medical bills, her paycheck disappeared faster than morning dew. But Damon was in his senior year of college, and she'd be damned if she'd let him drop out for money when he was so close to his engineering degree. "Yeah, I've got it," she typed back, then immediately opened her banking app to transfer money from her savings that were getting dangerously thin. "Ms. Johnson." Alexander's voice cut through her financial anxiety. He was standing in his doorway, looking irritated. "The Morrison client called. Apparently there's an error in the contract you prepared." Clara's spine straightened. She never made errors in contracts. "I'll pull the file and review it immediately, sir." "See that you do. This deal is worth $30 million. I can't afford mistakes." The implication hung in the air like smoke. "Your mistakes." Clara bit the inside of her cheek to keep her expression neutral, but inside, Irritation flared hot and bright. She'd been preparing Alexander's contracts for 3 years without a single error, but he was ready to assume this one was her fault before even investigating. She pulled up the Morrison file, cross-referenced it with the original terms, and within minutes found the discrepancy. The client had requested last-minute changes that weren't reflected in the contract Alexander had signed. Clara had sent him an email about the changes yesterday at 6 p.m., an email that was still sitting unread in his inbox. She printed out her email, highlighted the relevant sections, and walked into his office. Alexander was leaning back in his leather chair, speaking into his headset in rapid-fire sentences about market projections. Clara placed the printout on his desk and waited. When he finished his call, he glanced at the paper, then at her. For a moment, something flickered across his face. Was it embarrassment? "I see," he said slowly. "The client made last-minute changes." "Yes, sir. I sent notification yesterday evening, but I understand you had the charity gala to attend. Would you like me to prepare the revised contract now?" Alexander studied her face for a moment longer than usual, and Clara had the strangest sensation that he was actually seeing her. Not just the reliable secretary who handled his schedule, but her. His eyes lingered on her face in a way that made her pulse quicken unexpectedly. "Yes," he said finally. "And Ms. Johnson? Good catch." It wasn't an apology, but from Alexander Walker, it was acknowledgement. As Clara returned to her desk, she caught herself wondering what it would be like if he looked at her like that more often, like she was a person worth noticing. Then she shook her head and opened the Morrison file. Dangerous thoughts like those were exactly why she kept her hair in a bun and her dreams carefully locked away. After all, invisible women were safer women, even if, sometimes, safety felt an awful lot like disappearing. Clara has spent 3 years being deliberately invisible at work. Do you think she's protecting herself or limiting herself? 3 days later, Clara found herself staring at her computer screen at 7:30 p.m., the office floor eerily quiet, except for the distant hum of cleaning equipment. She rubbed her tired eyes beneath her glasses and stretched her neck, feeling the familiar ache from hours hunched over contract revisions. The Singapore deal had exploded into a maze of legal complications, and she'd spent the entire week coordinating between lawyers, translators, and Alexander's increasingly frustrated demands for updates. Her stomach growled, reminding her that the granola bar she'd grabbed at lunch was hardly sufficient fuel for a 14-hour workday. But Damon had texted earlier about needing help with his final project presentation, and their mother had called twice about changing insurance providers, responsibilities that would have to wait until she finished the quarterly expense reports that Alexander needed first thing tomorrow. "Still here, Miss Johnson." Clara's fingers froze over the keyboard. She turned to find Alexander standing behind her, his tie loosened and the top button of his shirt undone. It was the most casual she'd ever seen him, and something about the sight made her pulse skip unexpectedly. "Just finishing the quarterly reports, Mr. Walker. They'll be ready for your morning review." He moved closer, and she caught a hint of his cologne, something expensive and woodsy that probably cost more than her monthly Metro card. "What time did you get in this morning?" 7:15, she answered automatically, then immediately regretted the honesty. It made her sound pathetically eager to please. Alexander frowned. "And you're still here at—" He glanced at his Rolex. 7:30. "That's over 12 hours, Ms. Johnson." Clara kept her expression neutral. The Singapore contracts required extensive revision, and Mrs. Pemberton from accounting needed the quarterly summaries expedited for the board meeting. I wanted to ensure everything was perfect. "Mrs. Pemberton?" Alexander's jaw tightened. Did she happen to mention that her request wasn't actually due until next Friday? Heat flushed Clara's cheeks. She'd spent 6 hours on reports that weren't urgent, sacrificing her evening because she trusted another department's timeline without verifying it herself. No, sir." She made it sound immediate. "Lydia Pemberton has a habit of making her poor planning everyone else's emergency." Alexander's voice carried an edge of irritation, but surprisingly it didn't seem directed at Clara. "You shouldn't have to work 14-hour days because other people can't manage their schedules." Clara stared at him, genuinely surprised. In 3 years, Alexander had never shown concern for her work-life balance. She wasn't even sure he'd realized she had a life outside the office. "It's fine, really. I don't mind staying late when needed." "When needed, yes. When convenient for others? No." He paused, studying her face with that same intensity she'd noticed the other day. "Have you eaten dinner?" The question was so unexpected that Clara blinked. What? Dinner. Food. Have you had any since lunch?" "I had a granola bar." "That's not dinner." Alexander glanced at his watch again, then seemed to make a decision. "There's a corporate dinner tonight. the Meridian Industries merger celebration. I need someone there who actually understands the contract details in case questions arise. Clara felt her stomach drop. Corporate dinners were for executives, people who mattered, people who weren't her. Sir, I think perhaps one of the vice presidents would be more appropriate. The vice presidents didn't spend the last 3 days restructuring the merger terms. You did. His grey eyes fixed on hers with an intensity that made her feel suddenly exposed. I need someone competent, Ms. Johnson. Someone who won't smile and nod when they should be taking notes. The compliment, if that's what it was, sent an unexpected warmth through her chest, but the practical part of her brain immediately began calculating obstacles. I don't have appropriate attire for a corporate dinner, Mr. Walker, and I'd need time to— The dinner doesn't start until 9. That gives you time to go home and change. He pulled out his phone and began typing. I'll have a car pick you up at 8:30. The restaurant is Le Bernardin. Clara's eyes widened. Le Bernardin. She'd seen it featured in magazines, the kind of place where appetizers cost more than her weekly grocery budget. Mr. Walker, I really don't think— Ms. Johnson. His voice carried the tone he used for closing arguments. This isn't a social invitation, it's work. Essential work that requires your expertise. Will you be available? When he put it like that, what choice did she have? Yes, sir. Good. Alexander was already heading toward the elevator, then paused and looked back. And Ms. Johnson, don't overthink it. You've earned your place at that table more than half the people who'll be there. The elevator doors closed behind him, leaving Clara alone with her racing thoughts and the sudden realization that she had exactly 50 minutes to transform herself from invisible secretary to someone appropriate for the most exclusive restaurant in Manhattan. She gathered her things with hands that trembled slightly, her mind spinning through her limited wardrobe options. The black dress she'd worn to her college graduation was probably her best bet, though it was 3 years old and definitely more job interview than corporate merger celebration. As she rode the elevator down to the lobby, Clara caught her reflection in the polished steel doors. For the first time in years, she really looked at herself, not the carefully constructed professional persona, but the woman underneath. Her grandmother's voice whispered again, "Sometimes the smartest thing a woman can do is let them underestimate her." But what happened when you were tired of being underestimated? What happened when someone finally offered you a seat at the table you'd been setting for 3 years? Clara stepped into the cool New York evening, her heart pounding with a mixture of terror and something that felt dangerously like excitement. She had 50 minutes to decide who she wanted to be when she walked into that restaurant. For the first time in her adult life, invisible didn't feel like the safest option. The Blacktown car would arrive in exactly 47 minutes, and Clara Johnson was about to discover that some invitations changed everything. Clara stood in front of her bedroom mirror, barely recognizing the woman staring back at her. The black dress, her only formal option, fit differently than she remembered. 3 years of rushed lunches and stress had carved subtle curves into her frame, and the fabric now hugged her body in ways that made her breath catch. She'd released her hair from its perpetual bun, letting her natural curls fall in soft waves past her shoulders. Without her oversized glasses, replaced by contacts she rarely wore, her dark eyes seemed larger, more expressive. Her hands shook as she applied lipstick, a deep burgundy she'd bought on impulse months ago and never had the courage to wear. The transformation was subtle yet profound, like watching a butterfly emerge from a cocoon she'd built around herself. "Damn, Clara." Her voice was barely a whisper in the small apartment. "Who are you?" Her phone buzzed. "Car arriving in 5 minutes." Panic fluttered in her chest. She grabbed her small black purse, the only one appropriate for such an occasion, and took one last look in the mirror. The woman looking back was confident, elegant, radiant. Everything Clara had convinced herself she wasn't. The elevator ride down to the lobby felt endless. When she stepped outside, a sleek black Mercedes waited at the curb. The driver, a distinguished man with kind eyes, opened the door for her. "Miss Johnson, I'm Byron, Mr. Walker's driver. You look lovely this evening." "Thank you," Clara murmured, settling into the leather seat that probably cost more than her monthly rent. Through the tinted windows, she watched familiar streets blur past, each mile taking her further from her comfort zone. 20 minutes later, Byron pulled up to Le Bernardin. The restaurant's understated elegance was exactly what Clara had expected, and exactly what intimidated her most. Soft lighting spilled onto the sidewalk, and well-dressed figures moved like shadows behind the floor-to-ceiling windows. "Mr. Walker asked me to escort you to the private dining room," Byron said gently, as if sensing her hesitation. Clara nodded, straightened her shoulders, and stepped out of the car. The moment her heels touched the pavement, she felt the shift. The way heads turned, conversations paused, eyes followed her movement. It was unsettling and thrilling in equal measure. Inside, the maitre d' led her through the main dining room toward a secluded area in the back. Clara was acutely aware of every step, every glance, every whispered conversation that seemed to pause as she passed. The private dining room housed 12 guests around a mahogany table set with crystal and silver that caught the candlelight like captured stars. Clara recognized several faces from business magazines and financial news programs, titans of industry whose decisions moved markets and shaped economies. But none of that registered the moment she saw Alexander. He stood near the far wall, wineglass in hand, deep in conversation with a silver-haired man she recognized as the CEO of Meridian Industries. Alexander was gesturing slightly as he spoke, his profile sharp against the warm lighting, completely at ease in a world of power and influence. Then he turned, and time seemed to suspend itself. Alexander's steel-grey eyes found hers across the room, and Clara watched his expression shift from polite attention to something raw and unguarded. His wineglass paused halfway to his lips. His conversation died mid-sentence. For several heartbeats they simply stared at each other across the elegant space. It was the CEO of Meridian who broke the spell, following Alexander's gaze and letting out a low whistle. "Well, Walker, you certainly know how to make an entrance. Who's the stunning woman?" Alexander seemed to remember how to breathe. He set down his wineglass and crossed the room with purposeful strides, never breaking eye contact with Clara. When he reached her, he stopped close enough that she could smell his cologne, see the flecks of silver in his grey eyes. "Clara Johnson," he said, his voice rougher than usual. "My executive assistant." The pause before his description of her role didn't go unnoticed by the other guests, several of whom exchanged meaningful glances. Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks, but forced herself to maintain composure. "Miss Johnson." Alexander's eyes traveled over her face with an intensity that made her pulse race. "You look—" He seemed to search for words, then settled on "professional." But the way he said it, with barely contained admiration, made "professional" sound like poetry. "Thank you, Mr. Walker." Clara was amazed. Her voice remained steady. "I hope I'm not overdressed for a business dinner." A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth, the first genuine smile she'd ever seen from him. "Not at all. In fact, I think you might be underdressed for how important you are to tonight's success." Before Clara could process the compliment, other guests began approaching. Alexander's hand settled lightly on her lower back, a gesture that sent electricity through her entire body as he guided her toward the group. "Gentlemen, allow me to introduce Clara Johnson, the woman responsible for restructuring the Meridian merger terms. Clara, this is Theodore Ashworth, CEO of Meridian Industries." Theodore, the silver-haired man, extended his hand with obvious appreciation. "Ms. Johnson, it's a pleasure. Alexander tells me you're the mastermind behind the contract revisions that saved us all considerable headaches." Clara shook his hand, acutely aware that every person in the room was studying her with new interest. "I simply ensured all parties' concerns were addressed, Mr. Ashworth. Mr. Walker's vision made the deal possible." "Modest and brilliant," murmured another executive, a woman with sharp eyes and perfectly coiffed auburn hair. "Where did you find her, Alexander?" "She found me," Alexander replied, and something in his tone made Clara glance at him sharply. 3 years ago. I'm just beginning to realize how fortunate that was." The evening progressed like a carefully choreographed dance. Clara found herself seated to Alexander's right, fielding questions about merger logistics with an expertise that impressed even her. But she was hyper-aware of Alexander's presence beside her, the way he listened intently when she spoke, how his fingers drummed against his wineglass when other men looked at her too long, the protective way he included her in every conversation. During the main course, Theodore leaned across the table. "Ms. Johnson, I have to ask, are you considering any career changes? Meridian could use someone with your analytical skills." The question hung in the air like challenge. Clara felt Alexander tense beside her, though he maintained his composure perfectly. "I'm very happy in my current position," Clara replied diplomatically. "Are you?" Theodore's eyes twinkled with mischief. "Because a woman of your caliber shouldn't be hidden behind a desk, no matter how important that desk is." Clara caught the sharp look Alexander shot Theodore, but before anyone could respond, she smiled and said, "Sometimes the most powerful position is the one people underestimate." The table fell silent, then erupted in appreciative laughter. Alexander's eyes met hers, and in them she saw something new, respect, admiration, and something deeper that made her heart race. As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, Clara found herself standing beside Alexander, near the restaurant's entrance. The night air was cool against her skin, and the city lights blurred around them like a dream. "That was—" Alexander began. then stopped. "Clara, you were extraordinary tonight." She looked up at him, this powerful man who suddenly seemed vulnerable in the soft light spilling from the restaurant. "I was just being myself. That's what made it extraordinary." His voice was quiet, intimate. "I've been blind for 3 years, haven't I?" Clara felt something fundamental shift between them, a recognition that this night had changed everything. The careful professional distance they'd maintained was dissolving, replaced by something electric and dangerous and wonderful. "Maybe we both have been," she whispered. Alexander stepped closer, and Clara's breath caught. For a moment, she thought he might kiss her right there on the sidewalk, with all of Manhattan as witness. Instead, he reached up and gently tucked a curl behind her ear, his fingers lingering against her cheek. "Let me take you home," he said softly. And Clara realized that home might never mean the same thing again. The Mercedes glided through Manhattan's glittering streets, but the silence inside was anything but peaceful. Clara sat in the back seat beside Alexander, acutely aware of every breath he took, every subtle shift in his posture. The city lights painted moving shadows across his face, and she found herself studying his profile, the strong line of his jaw, the way his fingers drummed against his knee in a rhythm that matched her racing heartbeat. "Byron," Alexander's voice cut through the quiet, "take the scenic route, through Central Park." "Of course, sir," came the reply from the front seat. Clara turned to look at him, confused. Her queen's apartment was in the opposite direction. "Mr. Walker, I know where you live." His grey eyes met hers in the dim light. I'm not ready for this evening to end." The honesty in his voice made her chest tighten. This was uncharted territory for both of them, the careful professional boundaries they'd maintained for 3 years dissolving with each passing moment. As they entered Central Park, the city's chaos softened into something more intimate. Tree-lined paths curved ahead of them, lit by old-fashioned lampposts that cast pools of golden light on the empty road. "Tell me something," Alexander said, turning slightly to face her. "How long have you been hiding?" Clara's breath caught. "I don't know what you mean." "Yes, you do." His voice was gentle but insistent. "That woman in there tonight, brilliant, confident, commanding respect from men who've been in business longer than you've been alive, that's who you really are. So why have you spent 3 years pretending to be invisible?" Clara looked out the window, watching the dark expanse of the park roll past. The question cut deeper than she'd expected. "Because invisible women don't get hurt," she said quietly. "Hurt how?" She was quiet for so long that Alexander probably thought she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "When I was 22, fresh out of college, I got hired at a financial firm in downtown Brooklyn. Small company, but I was so excited. My first real job, decent pay, chance to prove myself." Clara's fingers twisted in her lap. "The senior partner took notice of me right away, said I was special, that he saw potential in me." Alexander's jaw tightened, but he remained silent. "For 6 months I thought I was advancing because of my skills. Late meetings, weekend projects, special assignments. I felt so proud, so chosen." Clara's laugh was hollow. "Then I found out he was having the same special meetings with 2 other young women in the office. When I confronted him, when I threatened to report him," she shrugged. "Suddenly my work wasn't good enough anymore. Suddenly I was making errors that needed correction. Within 2 months I was fired for performance issues." The Mercedes had stopped at a red light, but Alexander didn't seem to notice. His hands were clenched into fists on his knees. "Clara," he said, and her name sounded different in his voice, softer, more personal. "What happened to you was not your fault. I know that, now." She finally met his eyes. "But it taught me something valuable. When you're remarkable, you become a target. When you're invisible, you're safe. And so you made yourself invisible." "I made myself strategic." Clara straightened, some of her natural fire returning. "I learned that I could be more effective working behind the scenes, that I could accomplish more when people underestimated me. I built walls that protected me while still allowing me to excel." Alexander was quiet for a long moment, studying her face in the passing streetlight. "But walls that keep pain out also keep everything else out." The observation hit Clara like a physical blow. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means," Alexander said, reaching over to take her hand, "that in protecting yourself from the wrong kind of attention, you may have also shut out the right kind." His thumb brushed across her knuckles, and Clara felt electricity shoot up her arm. The simple touch was more intimate than anything she'd experienced in years. "What kind of attention is the right kind?" she asked, though her voice came out breathier than intended. Alexander's eyes darkened. "The kind that sees your brilliance and wants to celebrate it, not exploit it. The kind that recognizes your strength and wants to stand beside it, not diminish it. The kind that looks at you and thinks—" He paused, seeming to wrestle with his words. The kind that thinks you're extraordinary, just as you are. Clara's heart was pounding so hard she was certain he could hear it. Alexander, I know this complicates things, he said quickly. I know I'm your boss, and there are rules and professional boundaries and a dozen reasons why this is complicated. But Clara, what I felt tonight, what I've been feeling, it's not going away just because it's inconvenient. The car had stopped, and Clara realized they were outside her building in Queens. The modest brick apartment complex looked shabby compared to the luxury they'd just left, but Alexander didn't seem to notice the contrast. Byron cleared his throat softly. We've arrived, Miss Johnson. But neither Clara nor Alexander moved. They sat in the charged silence, hands still connected, the weight of unspoken possibilities hanging between them. I should go, Clara said finally, though she made no move toward the door. So you should, Alexander agreed, though his grip on her hand tightened slightly. My brother will be wondering where I am. Of course. And tomorrow is Thursday, the Hartwell presentation. Right, the presentation. Neither of them moved. Finally, Clara laughed. A soft, genuine sound that seemed to surprise them both. We're being ridiculous. Alexander's smile was rueful, completely ridiculous, but his eyes were warm, affectionate. Clara, can I ask you something? What? Tomorrow, when you come into the office, will you still be hiding? The question was loaded with meaning. Clara understood that he wasn't just asking about her appearance or her professional demeanor. He was asking if she was ready to step out from behind the walls she'd built, to risk being seen completely. I don't know, she answered honestly. This is all very new for me. For me too, Alexander admitted. But I meant what I said earlier. You've been hiding in plain sight for 3 years, and I've been too blind to see what was right in front of me. I don't want to be blind anymore. Clara looked up at her apartment building, then back at Alexander's earnest face. Something fundamental had shifted tonight, and there was no going back to the safe, invisible version of herself. Alexander, what happens now? Now, he said, reluctantly releasing her hand and reaching for the door handle. I walk you to your door like a gentleman. Tomorrow we figure out how to navigate whatever this is becoming, and somewhere in between, we both stop pretending that tonight didn't change everything. As they walked up the steps to her building, Clara felt the evening air cool against her skin and realized that she wasn't the same woman who had left this apartment 3 hours ago. That woman had been invisible by choice. This woman, the one walking beside Alexander Walker with her heart pounding and her future suddenly full of terrifying possibilities, this woman was about to learn what it meant to be truly seen. And despite her fears, despite the complications, despite everything logical that told her to retreat back into safety, Clara Johnson was ready to find out who she could become when she finally stepped into the light. Thank you, she said as they reached her door, for tonight, for seeing me. Alexander's smile was soft, genuine. Thank you for letting me. As his footsteps faded down the hallway, Clara leaned against her door and wondered if some transformations were irreversible. She was about to find out. Clara stared at her reflection in the bathroom mirror at 6:30 a.m., her hands trembling as she reached for her hair tie. The woman looking back at her bore little resemblance to the invisible secretary who had inhabited this same space yesterday morning. Even without makeup, even in her simple cotton pajamas, there was something different in her eyes, a spark that hadn't been there before. She twisted her hair into the familiar bun, then stopped. Alexander's words echoed in her memory. Tomorrow, when you come into the office, will you still be hiding? Clara released her hair, letting the soft curls fall around her shoulders. Her hands shook as she applied a touch of mascara and the burgundy lipstick from last night. When she slipped on her contact lenses instead of her oversized glasses, the transformation was subtle but unmistakable. In her bedroom, she bypassed her usual shapeless blazers and selected a fitted navy dress she'd bought 6 months ago but never worn. It was still professional, still appropriate, but it actually fit her body instead of hiding it. Her phone buzzed with a text from Damon. Sis, whatever happened last night, you're humming. You never hum before coffee. Clara paused, realizing she had indeed been humming unconsciously. When had she started doing that? The subway ride to Manhattan felt different too. She found herself making eye contact with other passengers, offering small smiles to the woman reading beside her, even helping an elderly man with his heavy grocery bag. It was as if stepping out of her invisible shell had made the entire world more vivid. But as the elevator climbed toward the 42nd floor, familiar anxiety began creeping in. What if last night had been some sort of temporary madness? What if Alexander regretted everything he'd said? What if she'd misread the entire situation and was about to make a fool of herself? The elevator doors opened and Clara stepped into the executive floor with her heart pounding. "Oh my God, Clara!" The exclamation came from Dalia Martinez, one of the junior executives who had always been friendly but distant. Now she was staring at Clara with undisguised amazement. "You look... wow. Did you do something different with your hair?" Before Clara could respond, more heads turned. Conversations paused. The same attention that had terrified her for 3 years suddenly felt manageable, different. "Just trying something new," Clara replied, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. She made her way to her desk, acutely aware of the curious glances following her movement, but instead of shrinking under the attention, she found herself walking taller, moving with more confidence. At exactly 8:30 a.m., the private elevator dinged, and Alexander stepped out. Clara's breath caught. He looked impeccable as always. Charcoal grey suit, crisp white shirt, silver tie that brought out his eyes. But when his gaze found hers across the office, something electric passed between them that made her forget how to breathe. Alexander stopped walking. For several seconds they simply looked at each other, and Clara was certain everyone in the office could feel the charged energy crackling between them. Then Alexander smiled, not his usual professional nod, but a genuine warm smile that transformed his entire face. "Good morning, Ms. Johnson," he said as he approached her desk, his voice carrying a note of appreciation that made heat bloom in her cheeks. "Good morning, Mr. Walker." She was amazed her voice remained professional when her heart was beating like a hummingbird's wings. "You look—" He paused, seemingly searching for appropriate words in a very public setting. "Well rested." The comment was innocuous enough for their audience, but his eyes told a different story entirely. Clara felt herself blushing. "Thank you, sir. Your Hartwell presentation materials are ready for review." "Excellent." Alexander glanced around the office, noting the curious stares they were attracting. "Could you bring them to my office? I'd like to discuss the strategy." As Clara gathered the presentation files, she was aware of Dahlia and several other colleagues exchanging meaningful looks. The office gossip network would be buzzing within the hour. Inside Alexander's office, he closed the door and turned to face her. The professional mask he wore in public fell away, replaced by something raw and honest. "Clara," he said softly, "you didn't hide." "No," she whispered, "I didn't." "How do you feel?" Clara considered the question seriously. "Terrified. Exhilarated. Like I'm walking around without skin." She paused. "Alive." Alexander moved closer, close enough that she could smell his cologne, see the flecks of silver in his grey eyes. "You're beautiful," he said simply. "You were beautiful yesterday and the day before that, and every day for 3 years, but now you're letting the world see it too." Clara's chest tightened with emotion. No one had ever spoken to her like that, with such genuine admiration, such reverence. "Alexander," she began, but he held up a hand. I know this is complicated. I know there are rules about workplace relationships and power dynamics, and a dozen other things that make this inadvisable." His eyes searched her face. "But I also know that what I feel for you, what I suspect you might feel for me, is too important to ignore because of corporate policy." Clara's pulse raced. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that I'd like to take you to dinner. Not a business dinner, not a corporate obligation. A real date where we can talk without worrying about who's watching or what it means for office politics." The invitation hung between them like a bridge Clara could either cross or burn down. "And if I say yes?" Alexander's smile was soft, hopeful. "Then we figure it out as we go. Carefully, professionally, but honestly." Before Clara could respond, her phone rang. The caller ID showed Lydia Pemberton from accounting, the woman whose urgent request had led to Clara working late the night everything changed. "I should take this," Clara said, but Alexander shook his head. "Let it go to voicemail. Lydia's crises can wait 5 minutes." His eyes were intense, focused entirely on her. "This can't." Clara looked at this powerful man who was asking, not demanding, but asking, for a chance to see where their connection might lead. 3 years ago, she would have been terrified of the risk, of the potential for heartbreak or professional disaster. But 3 years ago, she had been a different woman. "Yes," she said softly. Yes. I'll have dinner with you. A real date." Alexander's smile could have powered the entire Manhattan grid. "Saturday night?" "Saturday night." Their phone buzzed simultaneously, Clara's desk line and Alexander's cell. The business day was beginning in earnest, demanding their attention and forcing them back into their professional roles. But as Clara turned toward the door, Alexander caught her hand gently. "Clara, thank you." "For what?" "For being brave enough to let me see you." As Clara returned to her desk, she felt the curious stares of her colleagues, but found that she didn't mind them anymore. Let them wonder. Let them speculate. Let them see that Clara Johnson was no longer hiding. Her phone finally stopped ringing, and the voicemail notification chimed. She listened to Lydia's message about another urgent project that probably wasn't urgent at all, and for the first time in 3 years, Clara smiled as she deleted it without calling back. Some things she was learning were more important than being the perfect invisible employee. Some things were worth stepping into the light for. By Friday afternoon, the entire 42nd floor was buzzing with speculation about Clara Johnson's transformation. Clara could feel the whispered conversations that stopped when she walked by, the lingering glances that followed her movement from the coffee station back to her desk. She'd worn another fitted dress today, deep emerald green that complemented her skin tone, and had caught 3 different colleagues doing double takes when she smiled instead of offering her usual polite nod. "So," Dahlia Martinez said, appearing at Clara's desk with 2 cups of coffee and a mischievous grin, "are we going to talk about the elephant in the room?" Clara looked up from her computer screen, where she'd been reviewing Alexander's schedule for the following week. "What elephant would that be? The one where you've suddenly transformed from Clark Kent into Superman, and our notoriously stone-cold CEO has been staring at you like you hung the moon." Dahlia settled into the chair across from Clara's desk. "Girl, the office pool has you 2 secretly married by Christmas." Heat flooded Clara's cheeks. "There's an office pool? Honey, there's always an office pool. Last month it was about whether Mr. Walker would actually fire the entire marketing department after the Kellerman disaster." Dahlia leaned forward conspiratorially. "But this week, it's all about you." Clara glanced nervously toward Alexander's office. He was on a conference call with Tokyo, his sleeves rolled up and his brow furrowed in concentration. Even from this distance, she could feel the familiar flutter in her stomach when she looked at him. "There's nothing to speculate about," Clara said carefully. "I'm still his assistant. He's still my boss." "Uh-huh." Dahlia's smile was knowing. "And I'm still pretending that my master's degree in international business qualifies me to fetch coffee for executives who couldn't find Japan on a map without GPS." Before Clara could respond, the elevator chimed and Octavia Sterling stepped out. Clara's stomach dropped. Octavia was everything Clara had spent 3 years trying not to be. Tall, blonde, impeccably dressed, and absolutely stunning. She was also the senior partner at Sterling & Associates, the law firm that handled Walker Industries' most important contracts, and if office gossip was accurate, she'd been trying to catch Alexander's personal attention for over a year. "Well, well," Octavia said, her designer heels clicking across the marble floor as she approached Clara's desk. "Someone's been making changes." Her tone was pleasant enough, but Clara caught the sharp assessment in her ice blue eyes as they catalogued every detail of Clara's appearance. "Good afternoon, Ms. Sterling," Clara replied professionally. "Mr. Walker is expecting you. He should be finishing his call with Tokyo momentarily." "I'm sure he is." Octavia's smile was perfectly polite and completely predatory. "You know, Clara, may I call you Clara? I have to say, your new look is quite bold." Dahlia made a small noise that sounded suspiciously like a stifled laugh, but Clara kept her expression neutral. "Thank you. It must be liberating, finally deciding to make an effort with your appearance. I imagine it opens up all sorts of new opportunities." The comment hung in the air like poison, sweet-sounding but deadly. Clara felt her carefully constructed confidence wobble for a moment. Then Alexander's office door opened, and he stepped out, still adjusting his tie after his conference call. His eyes immediately found Clara, and the warm smile that spread across his face was so genuine, so unguarded, that several nearby conversations stopped entirely. "Octavia," he said, finally noticing his waiting appointment. "Right on time." "Alexander." Octavia's voice took on a purring quality that made Clara's teeth clench. "You look wonderful. That tie brings out your eyes." Alexander glanced down at his tie, a simple navy blue that Clara had actually complimented that morning, then looked back at Octavia with polite indifference. "Thank you. Shall we discuss the Henderson contracts?" As they disappeared into his office, Clara tried to focus on her work, but Octavia's words kept echoing in her mind, finally deciding to make an effort with your appearance. "Don't let her get to you," Dahlia said softly. "Octavia Sterling has been circling Alexander Walker like a shark for months. She's probably panicking that someone actually caught his attention." "I haven't caught anyone's attention," Clara protested, but even as she said it, she could see Alexander through his office window, gesturing as he explained something to Octavia. When he turned slightly, his eyes found Clara's through the glass, and he offered a small private smile before returning to his conversation. "Right," Dahlia said dryly. "And I'm the Queen of England." The meeting stretched for over an hour. Clara tried to focus on her work, but she found herself glancing toward Alexander's office more often than she cared to admit. Through the glass, she could see Octavia leaning forward, touching Alexander's arm when she made a point, throwing back her head when she laughed at something he said. When they finally emerged, Octavia was practically glowing with satisfaction. "Alexander, we simply must continue this conversation over dinner. I have some ideas about the international division that I think you'll find stimulating." Her hand lingered on his arm as she spoke. Clara's stomach clenched, but Alexander stepped back slightly, creating distance between them. "I appreciate the offer, Octavia, but I have other commitments this weekend." Octavia's smile faltered for just a moment. "Of course. Perhaps next week? Perhaps. Ms. Johnson will coordinate our schedules." Alexander's tone was professionally polite but decidedly cool. After Octavia left, Alexander approached Clara's desk. "Could you step into my office for a moment? I need to discuss the Henderson timeline." Inside his office with the door closed, Alexander's professional mask dropped completely. "Are you all right?" he asked, moving closer. "You seem tense." Clara looked up at him, this powerful man who somehow always seemed to know when something was bothering her. "It's nothing, just office dynamics." "Octavia," it wasn't a question. "She made some comments about my new look." Clara tried to keep her voice light, but Alexander's expression darkened. "What kind of comments?" "Nothing overt, just," Clara shrugged, "implications that I'm suddenly making an effort to get attention." Alexander was quiet for a long moment, his jaw tight with controlled anger. "Clara, look at me." She met his eyes, and the intensity there took her breath away. "You are brilliant, beautiful, and remarkable. Not because of what you wear or how you style your hair, but because of who you are. Anyone who tries to diminish that is threatened by your light, not concerned about your choices." Clara felt tears prick at her eyes. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm making a mistake, if I should just go back to being invisible." "Hey," Alexander's voice was gentle as he reached out to touch her cheek. "The only mistake would be dimming your light, because others can't handle its brightness." The tenderness in his voice, the way he looked at her like she was precious, made Clara's heart race. "Besides," Alexander added, his smile turning playful, "I have a selfish interest in you, staying exactly as radiant as you are. I have a date with you tomorrow night, and I plan to be the proudest man in whatever restaurant we choose." Clara laughed despite her emotional turmoil. "You haven't even told me where we're going." "That," Alexander said, his eyes twinkling, "is because it's a surprise. But I will say this, wear something that makes you feel as beautiful as you are." As Clara returned to her desk, she realized that Octavia Sterling's attempt to undermine her confidence had backfired spectacularly. Instead of making her retreat, it had reminded her why she decided to step into the light in the first place. Some women try to tear others down to elevate themselves, but some women, the ones worth knowing, lifted each other up. And tomorrow night, Clara Johnson was going to discover exactly what kind of woman she wanted to be when the man she was falling for looked at her like she was the most remarkable person in his world. Because for the first time in her life, she was beginning to believe that maybe, just maybe, she was. Clara had changed outfits 4 times before settling on the midnight blue dress that made her feel like she was wearing confidence itself. "You're glowing," Damon observed from the doorway of her bedroom, grinning as he watched her apply a final touch of lipstick. "Like, literally glowing. It's kind of freaking me out." "I'm not glowing," Clara protested, but she caught her reflection in the mirror and had to admit her brother might be right. There was something radiant about her tonight, a warmth that seemed to emanate from within. "Uh-huh. And this mysterious date you won't tell me about has nothing to do with it?" Damon leaned against the doorframe, studying her with the protective older brother expression that had appeared the moment she'd mentioned going out tonight. "It's just dinner, Damon. With someone who makes you hum unconsciously and spend 3 hours getting ready for just dinner." His voice was teasing, but his eyes were serious. "Clara, you know I trust your judgment, but you're going to worry anyway because that's what big brothers do," Clara finished, turning to face him. "I know, and I love you for it, but I'm 26, not 16. I can handle 1 dinner date." Damon was quiet for a moment, then his expression softened. "You look happy, sis. Really happy. I haven't seen you like this, maybe ever." Before Clara could respond, her phone buzzed with a text. "Byron is downstairs whenever you're ready. No rush. A." The thoughtfulness of the message, letting her know she wasn't being rushed, signing it with just his initial like a secret, made her heart skip. "That's my ride," she said, grabbing her small black purse and the wrap she'd borrowed from her neighbor. "Your ride has a name, right?" Damon called after her as she headed for the door. Clara paused, turned back and smiled. His name is Alexander. And Damon, I think you're going to like him. The Mercedes was waiting at the curb, Byron behind the wheel with his usual kind smile.